Hi, this is Mike Humphrey. I'm CEO of Next Up Speakers, and I'm so glad to have a good friend and I think one of the coolest thought leaders I've ever met, Jamie Mustard, with me today. Thank you, Jamie, for joining.
Thank you for agreeing to do this.
This is great. I had the chance to read Jamie's book as he was writing it, and I felt I needed to put something on the cover of his book and to talk about it. And let me just read it because I think this really talks to who Jamie is and what he's about. So, in my 30 years of representing speakers, leaders, and thinkers, including Jimmy Carter, Carl Sagan, Desmond Tutu, Peter Drucker, Jared Diamond, Margaret Atwood, Malcolm Gladwell, and Hunter S. Thompson, to name a few, I've seen, studied, and lived with a lot of ideas. I could say from this unique vantage point that the Iconist is special. Imagine that you're driving on a winding mountain road as dusk approaches. As it gets darker, you turn on your lights. Then fog emerges and becomes thicker as time goes on. The once helpful car lights are now blinding you in the fog. You must slow down. Eventually, you decide to pull over when the fog becomes too thick and too hard to get through. Now think of the fog as the information that bombards us every day. The very tools and skills used to navigate the road ahead became a hindrance when the fog grows thick. The Iconist provides you with a new toolkit and expertise to pierce through the fog. In a world where each of us is struggling to matter, Jamie Mustard provides us hope for the future. I probably feel that even more so today.
Well, I feel that's my favorite endorsement in the book. And it's the longest one, and it's my favorite endorsement in the book because it really taps into, my purpose and what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to explain to people that no matter what they're doing in the world, but especially somebody that's working visually, whether they're an artist or a designer, that designing in a world that's not overloaded with too much content and designing in this brave new digital world that is where we're all overly bombarded with content and the psychological effects that has on us, you have to be designing from a different perspective. And the first rule of that would be, and it kind of goes to the heart of the book, The Iconist, the art and science of standing out is the subtitle. But the first rule of that is, in a world overloaded with content where people are getting constantly assaulted, anything busy gets instantly discarded. In other words, whatever you're communicating with up front, if people can't understand that first image up front in their lizard brain before they have a chance to think, like a road sign or a warning label, we just get it with all the negative space around it, it gets instantly thrown out and discarded. That wouldn't have been true 30 years ago. So I do think the role of the designer in a world where scarcity of attention is the most difficult commodity to acquire is the primary challenge of designing in a world that is just a digital pummeling 24/7 globally.
Well, let me ask you this. I find that there is a balance with great designers between discipline and artistry, between conformity and non-conformity. How do people stand out while being accepted and really getting to where they want to be?
A major part of my job is I get to work as an art director and I get to work as a creative director. So, I'm constantly dealing with these issues and different types of designers and that look at the world from different perspectives, right? And I think, we were talking before this conversation about how, you could have somebody with a law degree and they could be as different as a farmer and a president of a country in terms of the personality and class difference of a type of lawyer. And I think the same is true for a designer, right? There's just so many ways of approaching design and looking at design. But I think that the way I look at it, first and foremost, is that, the difference between art and design is design is commercial. Design serves the client, right? So the first most important thing is that you're serving the communication of whoever has hired you to design for them. And that is the primary imperative. So the first part of that imperative is if no one is grabbing attention, because if you can't grab attention, then you're not serving anyone, because people look at visual image, there's so much imagery out there. Why are they going to stop and look at your imagery? And we're going to talk about that in relation to these primal laws, these Gladwellian laws in my book, explain why we pay attention to one thing and ignore another, right? But one thing I thought about when you were saying that is, what I do is I examine the people that I love. I examine the artists that I love. I love Warhol. I love Van Gogh. I love lots of different types of obscure artists. And I ask myself, what is it about this artist or designer that's resonating with me? Because that will typically tell you a little bit about yourself. If you admire something, and you'll find patterns in the things that you admire and that you're attracted to. And then you should explore your work in relation to the things that inspire you. So I look at who I like, and then I ask myself, okay, what makes me different or even better than the people I admire? What can I do better than that person? What can I do different, but it's still on their same wavelength? And that's how I found my style as a writer. And that's how I think a lot of designers find their style. But one of the things that I think a lot about in terms of design, I work with this incredible industrial designer in Portland. He's my favorite designer that I work with. His name is Mark Slotemaker, very unassuming guy. He doesn't have the flamboyant personality that a lot of designers that I work with are, but I think he has a mastery that's just incredible. And when we're working together, one of the things that he brings up all the time is he quotes Tibor Kalman, who designed some of the original Talking Heads covers, had a concept of, and I'm paraphrasing here, perfectly off, just right. So what Mark and I will normally do is we'll collaborate and we'll make something perfect, and then we'll say, okay, or when it's almost there and it could be perfect, how can we make it just off? How can we flip a letter upside down? How can we turn an image on its head? How can we make it a little bit off? And there's something about that I think creates a magnetism. Obviously, in my book, I declare that there's primal laws as to why we would lock on one design and ignore another. And you could have the artist whose design you ignore based on these primal laws that I outline in the Iconist could be the far, far better artist. What causes us to lock onto something, and then talent or skill as a designer or artist are completely different. Where the magic happens is when you have a very, very skilled artist or designer with very, very deep technique that also understands these primal laws, and they put them together. Then you have something that's irrepressible.
Two of my favorite architects, Mies van der Rohe and Frank Gehry. So almost the exact opposite of the spectrum. One is about functionality and cubism, and another is more about this beautiful flow. The use of materials that you would never think to have these wonderful curves, and both have these striking works that they've done. So talk about this idea about finding the thing that you feel is most important, not necessarily copying what somebody else is doing.
In the book, I don't know how much of it ends up in the book, but I interviewed the guy extensively. One of Gehry's proteges, a project manager on Disney Hall, a guy named Clyde Wilkinson, who is considered the world's top workplace designer. He's called a pioneer of workplace design. He did the Googleplex. He did he's done every major, worked for all these different major corporations in terms of designing interior spaces that create, that are what he feels maximizes human potential. Clive is very interesting in the sense that he believes that if we look at a workspace the same way that we look at an opera house or a cathedral, that with the same level of celebration and exaltation, that if we design a workspace like that, we can, that improves the output and the inspiration within that workplace. And with that basic philosophy, he's got an incredible book out where he talks about this that just came out several months ago called The Theater of Work, because he looks at work as a theater. And his whole concept, when I first met Clive, just to go back to the Geary point to address your question, when I first met Clive, it was at a party in Russian Hill in San Francisco. And I had this concept of blocks, which is like these big monolithic things, this big monolithic thing that you instantly understand. You have Geary, this big basic shape or connection of shapes done in his style. You understand in your lizard brain that it's a Geary before you even have a chance to think. And this was inspired, me looking at two-dimensional design we're looking at Geary that way. And what inspired the book, the first person that got me thinking about, does this pattern of why we notice one thing and ignore another translate from music to design to concepts to speeches? When you use a big monolithic shape and the first thing you notice is this big Sesame Street monolithic shape, that anything big and monolithic, like a road sign or a warning label, it will instantly attract our attention despite how busy everything else is around it. And then if it has some unique identity in it, like the shape of a Geary, then it pulls us in even more and we stay. And that's the primary concept is explained in this book, which is called blocks. And a block is a repetitive signature monolithic style or image that you repeat over and over that represents you. And once you repeat something like that over and over, you can make something iconic in someone's mind in a matter of minutes, 5 minutes rather than 5 or 50 years. And you can do it deliberately and at will rather than through hope, luck, chance, or years. And ultimately, what Clive argues is if you look at a design space like a cathedral or an opera house, you're changing the output that occurs in that space, and therefore contributing to the world in a more profound way. You're contributing to the world by creating a designed environment that then changes the way that people and improves the way that groups of people contribute to the world. And the way I think about that is this: everything is designed. Whether it's we have homeless camping in downtown Portland, and it's you go to downtown Portland these days, and there's these weird complexes of tents and tarps, and they're dirty and mangy, and they're completely disordered. Well, that disorder is a form of design, the same way any form of design that you would see in nature. When you see some sort of symmetry in nature or lack of symmetry in nature, design exists whether it's good, bad, intentional, or unintentional. So back to the original question, when something is designed well, something that can please or inspire or move the human spirit, I believe that it improves the human condition and contributes to the world. And that's why we focus on good design rather than just accept whatever design is there. But whatever is happening, there is design. A junkyard or a city dump is a form of design. It's just wherever the garbage falls. So, hopefully the people watching this are people that want to be creating design that's going to move products, services, people, ideas, and messages and the world forward.
When you bring up nature and nature design, the field of biomimicry is continuing to be a growing field of using nature's design to solve human problems. We see that all the time in homeopathy, where sometimes it's nature that can solve the problems of human health and the human condition. Which brings me to this idea about design, maybe a conflict that goes on between the need and the want. It feels like design, first and foremost, is to solve a need issue, whatever that design is built for. But then there's the want. Like the need seems to be oriented towards the head, the thinking part. What functionality do we need? Is it the most efficient it can possibly be? And then there's the want, which is we want to ignite the heart. Every time I look at it, I want to feel something. So how do you temper the two? How do you balance them?
I mean, what first popped into my head when you were talking was was Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? That of course we first have to think about the things that we need for our basic survival, right? Food, shelter. But once human beings, according to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, get above these basic necessities for shelter and survival, then this concept of, it's a big word, big concept, of self-actualization comes into play, right? And, self-actualization, all that really means is something that's really important and fundamental to human existence. That's actually quite basic, which is we have things in our lives, especially anybody that's pursuing a career as a designer, that's an inspired activity that comes from within, and then it goes out into the external world, okay? So when I think of self-actualization, I think of this idea of whatever we're feeling internally, that what we produce externally in terms of the way we live our lives or our creative work, that those match as much as possible. When those two things match, then we have what I would call somebody that's transcending towards self-actualization. But I would go further and argue that design affects the mood and the feeling of people in such a powerful way that even if someone is dealing with, isn't gotten to the point where they've risen above their basic needs for survival in terms of food or shelter, that design affects them. And it could probably, I like to think that it could improve their ability to get shelter, get food, get shelter and food better, right? I mean, a spear, if you're hunting, if it's 50,000 years ago and you're hunting I was going to say gazelle or an emu or something, a spear is a form of design. So I'm a firm believer that if we're creating tools as designers, and those cool tools could be, a tool to make move a message. It could be a warning label. It could be a stop sign. It could be the way you design a pen. It could mean the way you design a mouse pad, the way Apple designs a computer, right? And I firmly believe that when those design, kind of like I was talking about with Clive a little bit earlier, when those designs are inspired, they greatly improve output. And I think that would be true even for people that if you that were I was talking to, again, I keep going back to my conversations with Clive because we were supposed to do this futurist talk together in downtown Los Angeles in mid-May, which is now canceled because of the current situation and why we're talking that video right now. And God, what did I say to him? Oh, I made some kind of dismissive comment to him about how he's one of the most successful designers in the world and he gets to work on all the big projects and he kind of laughed at me and he said, that's not true. I said, well, you did the Googleplex, you did this. And he said, that's one thing here, it's one thing there. That's not how I built my company. And again, we're talking about the top workplace designer, one of the top interior architects in the world. He said, I built my company on bidding on projects that were mid-range and saying, we'll come in at the same budget, but we'll give you something inspired. We'll give you something that will move your people. And he built his company on those kind of projects and economy projects, but delivering so much more in terms of creating a theater in which people could exist or work. design can change the human experience, I think there's probably a lot of opportunity for same or lesser costs to design. If you go in with that inspiration, with that point of view, to design things that can help anyone at any part of the socioeconomic scheme and world in which we live.
Well, I'm curious as to things like how technologies and materials affect innovation in design. Brakes on a car is a great example. You can say that brakes are incredibly about need, about pure functionality, but design can also take a look at new materials that can be used to be more efficient braking materials, allowing for a car to have longer lasting brakes, more efficient brakes, whatever those might be. So even the mundane issues that are design oriented can be greatly affected not just by pen on paper, but by other external factors in the creation of what you're looking at. So how would you ask people to look at the outside world?
First of all, I would recommend an incredible episode of Abstract. There's a show called Abstract. It's about design on Netflix. And there's an episode with the woman that runs the design lab. She's an architect. She runs the design lab at MIT. Her name is, I hope I don't get her first name wrong, but I believe her name is Neri Oxman. Every design student should watch that episode of Abstract on Neri Oxman, because she's talking a lot about this, using nature as an inspiration to see the way we design things in the future, growing materials, testing materials. Yeah, I mean, I think that materials are a product of the era we live in. So we want to design for our time. We want to be modern. I think that the quality of a materials has energy connected to it. So I think that, if you're making something that's going to be tangible or practical, that people are going to touch, that the materials that it's made out of have an incredible impact on how the overall design is. If it's cheap material versus a fine material. All of these affect us in a way that is very powerful, in a way that we feel but do not see, like a bass note. The same way I feel if a designer is designing on a cheap tablet that they don't like versus their favorite type of tablet or Apple product or if they have very well designed tools that they love, I believe that will change their outcome. It will be more inspired. It will move design and their projects and humanity forward in a more aggressive way. Even though you don't see it, you feel it. I feel like materials and the choice of materials have a very similar impact in terms of the way that they impact design. It's something that we feel but maybe do not see. But when I compare it to a bass note, I mean, you feel that, right? That's what creates the right? So it's a very, very major part of the feeling, even though we don't necessarily hear the bass note.
In your book, you address this idea of digital tsunami hitting us, incredible amounts of white noise coming in all digital forms right now. And it reminds me of a chapter of John Naisbitt's book, Megatrends 2000, which then he wrote an entire book on this. So how would you react to the title of that book, High Tech, High Touch, and how it would be interpreted by designers?
If the designer decides to get the book that's watching this, it will give you the primal laws as to why people notice one thing and discard another. It's not going to make you a better designer. It's going to make you a designer that knows how to get people to magnetize onto one thing or repulse people. That should be used like a tool. That's not it. That does not have the purpose to affect the artist, to affect the designer. It should be looked at as like a color or the type of brush you're using. Okay, but I'm going to answer your question now. One of the concepts I talk about in the book is this concept of dilution. Dilution, dilution, being diluted. And what I explain is that if you were designing something 30 years ago, before all this explosion of digital onslaught, there's less things. So people are going to have a deeper connection with your design because there's not all these other things around it competing for attention. Now, people were seeing maybe 250 advertising messages a day in 1950. That was 2,000 by 1970. By the late 90s, it was up to 7,000. Today, with social media and ads and everything, people are hit with 10 to 15,000 advertising messages a day. This completely changes the way that they interact, like a chemical reaction, the way they interact with design. Because there's more, they can't interact as deeply. So you need to understand these primal laws if you want them to have a deep engagement. But to get back to the question of high tech, high touch, here's the answer. The primary driving force of the human condition, and any designer that takes this on and truly understands this is going to be far more effective, is meaning. We are creatures that are happier, more productive, more robust, better, more creative, more disciplined. We do everything better when it is attached to meaning, okay? And how I would translate that in terms of a designer's output would be impact. When something is irrepressible and it grabs us, that's an expression of disciplined meaning. When disciplined meaning goes into something that's creative and it comes out the other end, the primary goal is something that's impact. It's a 2x4. It grabs you by the top. It's a hook. Great design with impact and meaning behind it, with discipline, grabs you by the collar and does not give you a choice. I talk about the primal laws of how to do that, not just with design, but with public speaking, through design, three-dimensional design, two-dimensional design, artists. I talk about it in relation to history, modern pop culture. I have academic studies that show it in terms of visual design, and how that, and academic studies that prove the same principles that show where we lock onto something in terms of visual design are the same reason we lock into music. But I would say that human connection, anything that makes us feel human, whether it's something visual, sonic, words, anything that creates impact that is anti-digital, opposite digital in terms of our internal feelings, is going to be far more powerful than anything digital. If you want to maximize impact, you'll maximize human connection and design that creates human feeling. And that's the sad part. There's lots of great things about technology in terms of the democratization of information and all sorts of benefits that come from it, access to information for people of all economic things that I just adore about technology. But the thing that's negative about it is it's detached us from each other. We spend less time together talking to each other directly. You and I are talking on a Zoom call right now. And we spend less time interacting in a human way. And that's progressively happened as technology has accelerated since, in the last 300 years, since we've kind of evolved out of being an agrarian, cultivating species. We've become more and more removed. And then digital technology is the ultimate example of that. And I talk about in the book an extreme example of that. There's been studies of isolation, what extreme isolation does to people in solitary confinement at supermax prisons. And it creates things like paranoia, anxiety, rage. And I believe that communicating largely through text messaging, technology, digital communication, I believe that is something that creates the same lower levels of anxiety, lower levels of rage, lower levels of paranoia. And that's all because we're getting away from human connection and physical connection and nature. So anything that maximizes humanity practical touch, nature, animals, anything that maximizes where we come from is in terms of, or in relation to design, is going to have far more impact. Things that tap into our humanity, if I had one word to describe what that does to us as human beings, is it makes us present. When we go into nature, it makes us present. When we connect to an animal, it makes us present. So design that taps into our humanity, it makes us immediately present. And then these are not concepts that I talk about in the book, but if you were to take those concepts and apply these concepts of these monolithic blocks that I explain with negative space around them, of how you can apply them to design, I think you would be undeniable, right? And that whatever you would be putting out would be a gut punch. But again, ultimately, if you can bring us back towards human connection, to answer your question, Michael, you're going to be more impactful and more successful as you design.
Yeah, just one quick thing I'd love to get your comment on, and we can wrap up. And that is that I would think that a great designer has great technical skills, but also has the courage to feel, to make things simple, and to be in touch with how people feel about what they're designing. What advice would you give people to balance those two areas?
Well, first of all, simplicity and instant understandability is key. If someone doesn't understand what you're presenting in their lizard brain, and I explain this in the book, before they have a chance to think, your design is discarded. And if you don't believe me, read that book and see if you still disagree. That being said, a good design, and this kind of goes back to your humanistic point. Good design requires that you be in touch with your own feelings, and this again ties into simplicity in this sense. If you design, people hide behind people. When you're simple and instantly understandable, you're exposed and you're vulnerable. So a lot of the times designers will make things too busy as a way to hide, okay? The opposite end of that, simplicity, what's connected to that simplicity, what I think you're getting at there, Michael, is, and you really have to be in touch with your inner emotion to understand on a human level, which can be very uncomfortable. That's something that has to be practiced, kind of embracing your inner vulnerability if you want to create design that's also externally vulnerable. I hope that makes sense. And if somebody is watching this and it doesn't make sense, go to theiconist.org, shoot me an email, and we'll have a phone call and I'll explain it to you and I'll give you examples and stuff like that if you don't totally understand what I mean by that. But is that what you were getting at? Or is that an answer?
Yeah, I just feel that it takes courage to design things that are simple. Simple sometimes is looked at as the opposite of desired, the opposite of what we strive to be in the world. Yeah, that's the thing that we gravitate towards the most.
The greatest designers are design things that are as simple as a road sign, but that have an ocean of complexity behind them. And when there's an ocean of complexity, but the top layer is something as simple as a Warhol. I mean, Warhol was a realist painter. He could draw you photoreal, and he chose to put forth simplicities with this ocean of complex knowledge. Again, that's like a bass note. When a designer takes that leap of faith in a way that's connected to their own vulnerability and their own humanity, that's when you have somebody that creates something special.
Well, I want to thank you for taking the time with me. As always, I learn a ton, and I don't think I'll ever stop learning from what's in your head and what you have to share with people. I want to thank you, and hopefully, the design students got something out of this that is beyond their textbooks.
I hope so. I was really bummed that I wasn't able to go to Texas and be with all of them, because giving this knowledge to the next generation of people that are going to be making our world is what inspires me the most. It's my passion, it's my heart. So I hope that this conversation has been useful for them.